Welcome to Witches in Yoga Pants, your cozy corner of the cosmos, where modern magic meets everyday life. We're here to explore magic, mindfulness, and personal growth with a grounded, no-fluff vibe. Whether you're into moon rituals, tarot spreads, or just trying to survive Mercury retrograde, you are in the right place. So get ready to disrupt some old patterns, explore what it means to reclaim your power, and remember who you really are. So pull up your yoga mat, light a candle, and let's get into it. Hello and welcome back. I'm really glad you're here. Today I want to ask you a question. Have you ever looked at an old photograph of yourself and thought, wow, that feels like another lifetime? Maybe it was a picture from high school or your wedding day, your first apartment, a vacation, or even a random afternoon years ago. You recognize yourself in the picture, but at the same time, you almost don't. It's familiar, but it also feels like you're looking at someone else's life. And this is not because you've forgotten who you were, but because you've become someone else entirely since then. I found myself thinking about this recently, about how strange life really is. We tend to think of our lives as one long, continuous story, and we measure it from birth until death. One lifetime, one journey. But when I really stop to think about it, I don't really feel that way at all. I felt like I've already lived several completely different lives. Not through reincarnation or past lives, although those are fascinating conversations. I mean within this one lifetime. When I think back to different seasons of my life, it's almost like they feel like they were separate worlds. There was a version of me who was a child, a version who was learning who I was and how the world worked. Then there was the version navigating school, friendships, and trying to figure out where I fit in. The version starting adulthood, believing I had life all figured out. The version before I found spirituality, before I understood energy, before I began working with clients, and before I learned to trust my intuition. Each one feels so incredibly real when I remember it, and yet each one feels incredibly distant, almost like remembering scenes from a movie that I watched years ago. And it made me wonder if maybe that's just part of being human. Maybe we don't just live one life in a lifetime. Maybe we live dozens of little lifetimes inside this one. Every chapter has its own beginning, its own middle, and its own ending. Each chapter introduces us to people we couldn't imagine living without. It gives us routines that feel permanent, dreams that consume our thoughts, challenges that seem like they'll last forever. And then, somehow, almost without us noticing, the chapter begins to close. Sometimes it closes gently, other times it closes all at once. But eventually we look back and we realize that an entire world we once lived in no longer exists. Think about all the places that have been important to you over the years. Maybe there was a neighborhood where everyone knew your name, a favorite coffee shop where the barista knew your order before you even walked through the door, a workplace where you spent more waking hours than you did in your own home. Maybe there's a classroom, a gym, a church, a park where you walked your dog every evening, a house that once echoed with laughter and conversation. At one point, those places were woven into the fabric of your everyday life, and you couldn't imagine your routine without them. Now, they may simply exist as memories. Some of them might not even be there anymore. Buildings change, businesses close, people move, neighborhoods transform. Life quietly rearranges itself while we're busy living it. And then there are the people. And I think this part's really fascinating. If I ask you to think about people who filled your days 10 years ago, I imagine faces would immediately begin appearing in your mind. Friends, coworkers, neighbors, people you talked to every single day, people you laughed with, people who knew exactly what was happening in your life. And at that time, it probably never occurred to you that one day they may simply become memories, not because anyone had done anything wrong or there was some dramatic falling out, but simply because life keeps moving. Someone changes a job, someone moves across the country, children grow up, schedules change, interests evolve. You start drifting apart until suddenly there's nothing at all. And it's really just because that particular chapter reached its natural conclusion. Isn't that the strange thing about being human? Someone can be one of the most important people in your life for years, and then one day you realize you haven't thought about them in months. Not because they weren't important, but because life kept inviting you both into new chapters. I think sometimes we judge ourselves for this. We wonder, should we have held on tighter, called more often, made more effort? And sometimes, yes, relationships deserve that effort. But other times they simply completed what they came to do in our lives. Not every relationship is meant to last forever in order to matter. Some people arrive to help us become the person we needed to be in that season. Some teach us confidence. Some teach us boundaries. Some remind us how to laugh and help us heal. Some challenge us in ways we would never have chosen for ourselves. Some walk beside us for decades, and others stay for a short time. Neither is more meaningful than the other. Length is not what determines the value of a relationship. Presence is. And maybe that's one of the most beautiful things about life. We don't always get to choose how long someone stays, but we do get to appreciate that for a period of time, our paths crossed. When I really start thinking about this idea, I realize that it isn't just the people or places that change. We change too. Maybe that's the most incredible part. Sometimes I think back to a decision I made years ago and I catch myself wondering, what was I thinking? And then I have to remind myself, I wasn't the person I am today. I was making that decision with the understanding, the experiences, and the perspective that I had at that moment. That version of me couldn't possibly know what this version knows. And one day, years from now, I'll probably look back at the decisions I'm making today and smile at how much I've continued to grow. The beautiful thing about living is that we're not supposed to stay the same. Sometimes we expect ourselves to have everything figured out. We almost hold ourselves to this impossible standard that once we've learned a lesson or reached a certain age, we should somehow stop changing. But when has nature ever worked that way? The seasons don't stop changing. The moon doesn't stop cycling. The tides don't just decide they're done moving. Everything in nature is constantly shifting, growing, shedding, resting, and becoming something new. Why would we be any different? And yet, every time our own lives begin to shift, we often resist it. We cling to what feels familiar because familiar feels safe, even when we've outgrown it. I think about the different dreams I've had throughout my life. Dreams that once felt absolutely essential. Dreams I couldn't imagine letting go of. Some of them came true, some of them didn't, and some quietly changed into something completely different. If you had told the younger version of me where I'd be today, I'm not sure she would have believed you. She couldn't imagine becoming this version of herself because she hadn't yet lived the experiences that would shape her into who she is today. And isn't that true for all of us? There are versions of ourselves that only existed because of the circumstances we were living in that time. The version of you who was someone's child, the version who was someone's partner, the version raising young children, caring for a parent, or the version grieving someone you loved. The version of you building a business or beginning a spiritual journey. Each one required something different from you, and each one revealed strengths that you may not have known you had, and each one eventually gave way to another chapter. Sometimes these transitions happen so gradually that we hardly notice. Other times they happen overnight. One phone call, one diagnosis, one move, one opportunity, one goodbye. Life has a way of changing direction in a single moment. And when we're living through these moments, they can feel overwhelming, sometimes even unfair. We wonder why everything has to change, why we can't just hold on to the life we've built. But looking back, I think most of us can recognize that every major turning point eventually led us to somewhere we never expected to be. Not always somewhere easier, but somewhere different. Somewhere that introduced us to new people, new opportunities, new lessons, and new parts of ourselves. And I think that's where this idea of living many lifetimes becomes very comforting. Instead of seeing change as something that's taking life away from us, maybe we can begin to see it as life inviting us into another chapter. Not replacing what came before, but building on it. Because here's the thing, none of those earlier versions of you disappear completely. They're still there. There's the little child who believed in magic, the teenager who felt everything so deeply, the young adult trying to prove themselves, the person who survived heartbreak and who found hope again, the person who took a leap of faith. They're all still part of you. They didn't vanish. They became the foundation that this version of you now stands on. Sometimes I imagine them all sitting around a table together, every version of myself from every season of my life. Some of them would probably disagree with each other, and they might laugh at what others believed. Some of them would be amazed by what eventually became possible, but I think every single one of them would recognize that they were doing the absolute best they could with the understanding they had at the time. And maybe that's something we could all offer ourselves a little more often. A little compassion for the person we used to be. It's easy to look back with today's knowledge and judge yesterday's decisions, but yesterday's version of you didn't have today's wisdom. They were simply living in the chapter they were in. And without that chapter, you wouldn't be here now. I think that's something worth remembering because so often we want to erase parts of our story. The mistakes, the relationships that didn't work, the jobs we hated, the years that felt wasted. But what if they weren't wasted at all? What if they were simply one of the many lives you've lived within a lifetime, not meant to last forever, just meant to become part of the story that brought you here? One thing I've come to notice is that most endings aren't dramatic. Movies have taught us to expect some big emotional moment where everyone says goodbye and the music swells, and we know with absolute certainty that that chapter has come to an end. Real life rarely works that way. More often than not, we don't realize something has ended until long after it's over. You don't know the last time you'll have coffee with someone. You don't know when it's the last family holiday before everything changes. You don't know when the last time your child will ask you to tuck them into bed. And you don't know the last time you'll walk through the front door of a house that held so many memories. Life doesn't usually announce these moments. It simply keeps moving. Sometimes I think that's why nostalgia can catch us so off guard. Maybe you're driving through a town you haven't visited in years, or you hear a song you haven't heard in decades. You stumble across an old journal while cleaning out a closet, and suddenly you're not just remembering something, you're remembering an entire lifetime. The people, the conversations, the worries that seemed so important, the dreams you had, the person you believed yourself to be. And for just a moment, it's all there again. And then just as quickly, you're back in the present. I don't think those moments are meant to make us sad, but they're reminders. Reminders that we've lived, we've really lived, that we've loved people and taken chances, that we've survived things we once thought would break us, and that we've become someone our younger selves could have never imagined. Sometimes I hear people say, that feels like a lifetime ago. And maybe that's because, in a way, it was. Not another physical lifetime, but another season of becoming. Another chapter that had its own beginning, its own story, and eventually its own ending. I also wonder if recognizing this can help us become a little gentler with the chapters we're living in now. There are probably people in your life today who you feel like they'll always be there. Places you visit so often that you could never imagine they could disappear. Routines that feel so ordinary you barely notice them anymore. But one day, years from now, this season may be one of the lifetimes you look back on. The ordinary moments that seem so insignificant today may become the memories you treasure the most. Morning walks, conversations over dinner, the way your dog greets you at the door, the laughter of friends, the familiar drive to work, the quiet evenings at home. So much of life isn't made up of extraordinary moments. It's made up of ordinary moments that become extraordinary only in hindsight. Maybe that's why gratitude is so powerful. Not because it asks us to pretend everything is perfect, but because it reminds us to notice the chapter we're living in before it quietly becomes another memory. And then there's something else I've been thinking about. Sometimes we spend so much energy trying to hold on to a chapter that's already ending. We keep trying to recreate what once was. We want the friendships to feel the way they used to. We want the relationship to go back to how it began. We want our children to stay little and our parents to stay healthy. We want our bodies to stay young, and we want life to stop changing. But life has never promised us permanence. What it does offer instead is movement, growth, experience, and connection. And if we're willing, the opportunity to become someone new over and over again. It doesn't mean we stop missing people. It doesn't mean we don't grieve the chapters that end. Of course we do. Some chapters deserve our tears. Some endings change us forever. But grief and gratitude can exist together. We can miss what was while still making room for what's becoming. Maybe that's one of the greatest acts of trust we can practice. Trusting that just because a chapter is ending doesn't mean the story's over. It simply means another page is waiting to be turned. Until next time, honor the people who helped shape your story, even if they're no longer in it. Be grateful for every version of yourself that carried you to where you are today. And remember that every ending creates the space for another beautiful lifetime to begin. Take what you've heard today even further by joining my newsletter community. Each week, you'll receive journal prompts and reflections connected to the episode that are designed to guide you in bringing these conversations off the podcast and into your own journey. Let's keep going deeper together. The link is waiting for you below.